Howdy guys, Ponchato here, and welcome to my $500 G5400 and 1050 Ti build. Today we're going to be putting together this budget gaming PC, and unlike that Verge video, I'm not going to give you a bunch of bad advice so you destroy all your components. I'll be gearing this video more towards people who are brand new to PC building. If you've literally never seen the inside of a computer before, don't worry. I'll walk you through step by step and explain everything as I go. And finally, at the end, we'll take a look at some gaming benchmarks to see how this build performs. Now, when you're putting together a PC, there are really only two tools you'll need. The first is a Phillips head screwdriver, and the second is a pair of pliers. And there are two main things to keep in mind as you're building to make sure you don't destroy anything. The first is always keep a hand on your case to keep yourself grounded. That way you don't kill anything with a static shock. And the second is nothing inside a PC requires gorilla strength tightening. If you feel like you need to force something, it's probably facing the wrong way. Now, with all that covered, let's get to the build. First, I just want to go over the parts really quick. In any computer build, there are 7 basic components: the processor, graphics card, motherboard, memory, hard drive or SSD, power supply, and then the case. Now, the processor I'll be using in this build is an Intel G5400, which is a good basic CPU with 2 cores and 4 threads, and plenty powerful for a budget build like this. The GPU will be an NVIDIA GTX 1050 Ti from Zotac, which is one of the most popular budget GPUs because it has really good 1080p performance and it's not that expensive. Now, for the motherboard, I went with Gigabyte's B360M DS3H, and the reason I picked this one is because it has 4 RAM slots so you can add more memory in the future, and an M.2 slot for an SSD, which is another really worthwhile upgrade. Now, memory is provided by Timetech. This is a great company for budget RAM because they forgo fancy heat spreaders and LEDs, so their memory runs a little bit cheaper than other companies. When you're working with a tight budget like this, that's exactly what you want to be looking for. Now, for the hard drive, I picked Western Digital's Blue 1TB drive. If you've watched my monthly build series, this shows up all the time in my recommendations because 1TB is a good starting point and it's cheap. Now, for the power supply, I picked Thermaltake's Smart 500. I've used this model in a few builds before because 500 watts is more than enough to power an entry-level build like this, and it comes with a 5-year warranty, which is much longer than most other power supplies in this price range. And finally, the case is an FBM X1 from Rosewell. Like the hard drive, this case shows up in my monthly builds all the time because it looks good and it's cheap. So we'll start assembly outside of the case. And the first thing is we need to get the motherboard out of its protective case or protective bag, SATA cable for hard drives and stuff. When you're building this stuff, generally you can just set it on the box. These bags are anti-static, so they are conductive. Don't set stuff on top of the bag, but hold on to the bag in case you need to ship it back for warranty work or whatever. There's our motherboard. Fancy. All right, so the first thing we'll do is we'll put in the processor, and that part, that goes right there into the socket. Now, these are shipped with a plastic cover over the CPU socket to protect the pins. Don't lose this plastic thing because if you need to ship it back, you're gonna have to use this to cover the socket again so that the pins don't get damaged while it's being shipped back. Now, in Intel sockets, there's a latch that clamps down on the CPU to hold it in the socket, and that's held down with a little latch right here. There we go. So you pull that back and you see it lifts up, and then you can stick the processor right there. So we'll get the processor out. First, when you're taking Intel processors out of their socket or out of their box, all of them come with a stock cooler. We'll be using this because the G5400 isn't that hot of a processor, and even though Intel stock coolers kind of suck, it's more than enough for a processor like this. So here's the CPU, comes in a little plastic case. You pop that open. Try to only handle the CPU by the edges. Don't grab it on the top and the bottom. Grab it by the edge, like that. Because all of these are all the contacts that make contact with the pins down there. You don't want to get fingerprints or anything on that. And same thing on the other side. This is the heat spreader. This is the part that makes contact with the cooler. You don't want to get this dirty because then it hinders thermal performance. For something this low power, it probably doesn't matter, but it's best to just develop good habits early. Now, when you're looking at the processor, there is one corner that has a gold triangle. The other 3 corners won't. And this triangle lines up with a triangle somewhere on the socket, which I am having trouble finding. Ah, there we go. Okay, yeah, so this is actually printed on the board. There's one corner that's gonna look different from the other 3. And when you're putting the processor in the socket, you just need to line those up. So I'll drop it in place. And the other thing is the CPUs are keyed, so you can only put it in one way. There are notches on 2 of the sides that line up with notches on the socket. Once that's in place, you just lower the retention bracket and then push down on the retention clamp. And then there's a small hook under there. It's pretty straightforward. But anyway, once it's installed, that's what it looks like. So the next thing is to install the processor heatsink. Now, Intel's stock coolers suck, but they do have one advantage in that they're extremely easy to put together. They use this push pin system, which doesn't require any screws or anything like that. You literally just set it on the processor and push the pins through, which is very nice. So to do that, there are 4 mounting pins, and there are 4 holes in the motherboard into which these pins get pushed. Line up the pins with the motherboard, and then you push down on each one, and it'll click when it's secured. And there we go. And on every motherboard, there'll be a 4-pin fan header into which you plug the CPU cooler, and they should be labeled. This one is CPU_fan. So you just line up the pins, push it in place. So now CPU and cooler are all set. Next, we'll put together the memory. So that's what memory looks like. Now for these, it's less important that you handle it by the sides, but you don't want to touch the gold part, the contacts right there, again, because fingerprints could interfere with the connections. So on motherboards with 4 RAM slots, you want to install memory in alternate channels, not next to each other, but slot 1 and then slot 3, or slot 2 and then slot 4. And very often they'll have little holder clip things on the side. You just pull those out to release them so that you can put the memory module in. And these, like the processor, are keyed. This center notch isn't exactly Is it centered? Yeah, no, okay. This center notch isn't exactly centered. So you'll need to make sure that it's lined up correctly when you're plugging it into the socket. And typically the way that it goes is the sticker, which is gonna have all of the voltage information and the speed and stuff like that, that in 99% of motherboards is going to be facing toward the CPU. So look for the sticker and then point that towards the CPU, line it up with the socket, and then you might need to wiggle it a little bit, but then push it all the way down. And the other thing is these latches on the side will get automatically pushed closed when the memory module gets shoved all the way in. If it doesn't, you'll just need to go in and make sure that they're fully closed. And then you repeat the same process with the second module. Point the sticker towards the CPU and then kind of rock it back and forth. It does take a little bit of force, but once it's in place, the latches will latch shut and then it's all good to go. So next we'll start assembling stuff inside the case. And to do that, we need to take off the side panel first. And there are 2 thumb screws on the back. Every case is set up like this. 2 thumb screws on the back that you unscrew, which will release the side panel. And you'll see that I still have the plastic on here. I leave that on until the end because I have scratched things before in the middle of a build and it's very sad. So setting that aside, we can now look inside the case. So inside every case, you're gonna have either a box or a bag of accessories, which for the most part means mounting hardware. Bunch of screws, which we'll need some of these. So set that aside. And then everything else in here is all the front panel wiring. So really quick, this mess of wires that's coming from the front of the case, this is for connecting the USB ports, the audio ports, the power button and reset switch, hard drive light, stuff like that. Your motherboard's manual will tell you where all this stuff needs to be plugged in. But for now, we'll just kind of set that aside so it's not as in the way. Motherboards aren't directly mounted to the case. You don't just set it in the case and screw it in. They're offset from the case with these little things, motherboard standoffs. And all they are is they raise the motherboard 1/4 of an inch away from the back of the case, so all of the leads on the back of the motherboard don't get shorted out by the case. Now, this case has motherboard standoffs pre-installed, but if you get a case that doesn't, don't forget them. I've done that before and killed motherboards, and it sucks. And it's a stupid mistake, so don't do what I did. Now the mounting locations on motherboards are fairly standard, but there is one that can change position, and in this case it's the lower rightmost front one. We'll need to move that one up 1 position, which is what the pliers are for. Now that the motherboard standoffs are in place, we need to put the I/O shield in the back of the case before we put the motherboard in. There it is. And these go in the back of the case, right there. To install them, you push them into the socket from the inside. And usually the circular holes go on the bottom. That's where the audio jacks are typically on motherboards. So you put those down. This is one area where it can occasionally take quite a bit of force. So that's where all the motherboard outputs are gonna be on the back of your case. Now we're gonna need to get the screws out that hold the motherboard in place. Cases typically come with screws for the power supply, the motherboard, and then the hard drives or SSDs or optical drives. We have, I think it's 6 mounting holes. I'm gonna find 6 of the motherboard screws. And now the fun part of me figuring out how to install this backwards so that you can see what I'm doing. It goes in something like this. If you can line it up correctly with the rear I/O panel, then it'll already be lined up with the standoffs. By the way, it's a lot easier to do this with the case on its side, but for the sake of showing you what's going on, I'm doing it the hard way. In fact, I just dropped one. Quite difficult to do it this way, but I'm not a quitter. There we go, so one's in place, and then I'm gonna put in the rest of the screws. I'm not gonna do it like this. All right, so now that the motherboard is installed in the case, I'm gonna plug in all of the front panel headers and the fan wires because these can be kind of hard to get to once you install the graphics card and power supply and all the other stuff. So there are basically 2 kinds of front panel wires, easy ones and not easy ones. The easy ones are the USB headers and the front panel audio because these are keyed and they're big connectors, so they're really easy to line up and really easy to connect. These ones, however, aren't. These are for the power switch, reset switch, power LED, and hard drive LED. For what reason these haven't been standardized, I have no idea, and they're really tiny, so they're a hassle to plug in. Now for this motherboard, the front panel headers are down here in the front, which is usually where they're positioned so that you can connect the front panel easily. And they are labeled on the motherboard, but it's a lot easier to reference the manual because everything is easier to read. And these are all polarized, so you need to plug the plus into the plus and the minus into the minus. Referencing the manual, again, makes this way easier. So those front panel connections are in place. Next we'll do the easy ones, the USB and the audio connections. Now on this motherboard, the USB 3 connection is right up at the front. And all of this is listed in the manual, at least hopefully. Next, the USB, that goes down there. And finally, the HD audio port. Now this one is very often all the way at the back, which is kind of unfortunate, but that's why I'm plugging it in first because it's way harder to get to once you have a graphics card in there. So now that we have the front panel headers plugged in, the next thing I'm gonna do is plug in the fans. Now these connectors are also keyed, so you can't plug them in the wrong way. On this motherboard, the rear fan connector is right there. So I'll just put that in place. And with that plugged in, now I'll plug in the front panel or the intake fan. The front panel header is actually toward the front and at the bottom, which is where it should be. And there we go. So that stuff is all plugged in. Next, we'll put in the graphics card. Everything is wrapped in an anti-static bag. Now, this graphics card is a little bit different than most these days because even though it does take up, it is a dual slot graphics card, the back panel only has a single slot. Normally on graphics cards, the bottom part is used for more connectors and also to have a vent so that it can exhaust air out the back. But this one only has one. Not a big functional difference, but where's my screwdriver? That's why it looks different. So to install that, that's what the panels on the back are for. You take the slot out to make room for whatever expansion card you're putting in place. Usually they're pretty much always held in with screws. So you don't want to lose these in case you need to put them back in. Now, graphics cards are really easy to install, especially ones that don't require an external power connector. All you need to do is plug it into the motherboard and then screw it into the back. Okay, now I forgot a part on this case. This isn't really standard. There's another panel here that needs to be unscrewed and removed to make room for the expansion cards. Now, we can plug the graphics card in. To do that, just line it up with the slot and then it needs to wiggle a little bit and it's in. Easy breezy. So then it's secured in place on the back. There we go. So now it's not gonna sag. And then we'll put this little retention bracket back on. There we go. Now our graphics card is installed. Not that bad. All right, so with that done, next we'll put in the hard drive. And for this, there's a support bar right there. It'll be easier to see once it's supporting a hard drive. I can't see it. Now you can see the hard drive right there. So the hard drive is secured with 4 more screws that came with the case. All you do is line up the mounting holes in the hard drive with the holes in the case. Don't fall, please. And then screw them in. Now technically, oh God, I hope that went into a hole. Yeah, it did. Now technically it'll probably be fine with just these 2, but for the sake of doing it all right, I'm gonna take off the back panel to get access to the other 2 mounting screw holes, which is gonna be a little bit harder to get to. The hard drive mounting holes are behind these 2 holes right there. So this is gonna be kind of hard. I mean, even if I weren't sitting in front of it, I just dropped it. Even if I weren't sitting in front of a camera, this would be difficult. Building a computer does require some dexterity and definitely patience. Ah, there we go, I think I got it. Oh God, I don't even know where that one went. Hey, there it is. I changed my mind. I'm vetoing that option. I can't get to the other ones. 2 screws is probably fine. Don't drop your case and you'll be good. So now our hard drive is installed. Well, it's in. It's not plugged in yet. Let's plug in the SATA cable. Hard drives and SSDs all require 2 connections. The first is a SATA cable like this, and this is the data cable. And then the second is a power cable, and that'll come from the power supply. But we'll do this one first because it's a little easier to get to before the power supply is installed. And like most things in computers, these are keyed as well. They're kind of an L shape. You can't plug it in incorrectly. And the connection for hard drives is on the back of the hard drive, which I'm not gonna be able to see from here, but I bet I can figure it out. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so that's plugged in. And that will go down to one of these SATA ports on the motherboard. So we'll just kind of loop it around and get it to one that works. There we go. So now the hard drive is plugged in there. We'll do the power supply, which is, I saved it for last because it's, as you'll see, kind of bulky. So inside the box, we have the whole thing. These are all the interior wires. And then the other side of the power supply has a plug for a wall plug. As you can see, there's a fan in the power supply, which in a top mounted case like this, you need to make sure that's facing down so that it's pulling air from inside the case and then out. Get the power supply in the top of the case, make sure you aren't pressing against the motherboard. And this one is a pretty tight fit, but there we go. Okay, so it's resting on the case right now, and we'll need to secure it with 4 screws, one at each corner. And these screws are also different from the motherboard and hard drive screws. And usually power supplies also come with their own mounting screws. For the most part, everything that you buy for a PC is gonna come with the stuff you need to mount it. And then, like everything else, make sure they're tightened all the way. Not Gorilla Tighten, just tight enough that they aren't gonna vibrate out. So now the power supply is installed too. This is 90% complete. All we have to do now is plug in the power cords that we actually need. Actually, really quick, I'll go over all the power connections that you'll get on a power supply. The first type of connector that's gonna come out of a power supply is old school Molex or peripheral connectors. These used to be used for powering fans and hard drives and all that stuff. They're very rarely used these days, so I'll just set that off to the side. The next are SATA power connectors. These are used to power hard drives, optical drives, SSDs, and these have been pretty well standard for, I don't know, 10 years now. Most power supplies will come with quite a few of those connections. And now there are 3 main connectors. The first is the 24-pin ATX cable. This is the motherboard power connector. Second is the 8-pin EPS connector. This is the CPU power connector, though this also plugs into the motherboard. It'll plug in near the processor. And finally, we have the PCIe power connectors. These are for powering graphics cards. And all of these connectors do look similar, but they are different and they are keyed. So you shouldn't be able to jam the wrong one into the wrong slot. Now for this build specifically, the graphics card doesn't require an external connector. So all we need to use are the CPU connector, the motherboard connector, and one of these SATA power jacks. Everything else will push it somewhere else so it's out of the way. Really quick, I'm gonna switch out the SATA connectors and use a right angle connector instead, because the hard drive data cable comes out right here and it would be better for it to go directly down. So the first one we'll plug in is the motherboard power cable. This will be plugged in at the front of the motherboard. It can require a bit of wiggling to get it snapped into place. Next, we'll plug in the CPU power cable, and that's going to be plugged in back up in this area. Snapped into place. And finally, we'll plug in the hard drive power. All right, so now it's all plugged in and ready to test. The cables look pretty ugly right now, and we aren't going to do cable management yet because I first want to do a test boot to make sure that everything is working correctly. Then once we do that, we'll deal with the cable management. All we need to do to test it is plug it in, turn it on, and see if it gets into the BIOS. Once we're in there, we can check to see that all of the components are being recognized, and if that's all good, then we can get to the cable management. I just want to point out a common mistake really quick, because if you do this and turn your computer on, nothing will happen and then you'll freak out. I know because I've done this. Now this motherboard has its own HDMI output, and so does the graphics card. And basically all motherboards, if a graphics card is plugged in, will disable their own internal connectors because they assume you're going to be running your monitors through your graphics card. So if you plug your monitor into the motherboard directly, it won't work. You need to plug it into the video card. With it all plugged in, it's time to test it. The first step is to flip the switch on the power supply on the back of the computer. If you don't turn that on, nothing's gonna work. And the next is press the power button and hope that it doesn't turn on. We'll try turning the power off and then turning the power back on. Yeah. What is that even stuck on? Okay, let's not do that. No, off. I want you off, please. I've identified the problem. Okay, so you're supposed to check that all of your fans are clear, because if they start spinning and there's a wire blocking them or getting in their way, the computer can kind of freak out and it'll make a lot of scary noises. The CPU fan cable was kind of draped through the middle of the fan, and it didn't like that. So I'm gonna go ahead and first flip the power and then move the fan cable around so that it's not running into the fan. Okay, so the CPU fan should be clear now and it should all be okay. So I'm gonna turn on the power and press the button. There we go. All right. Almost. It's thinking about it. Oh, it's totally gonna work. Yeah, yes, that worked. Okay, it's working. All right, so that is a really good demonstration of the little bit of uncertainty the first time you turn everything on. Computers are wildly complicated machines, and little bits can get jostled around in shipping and as you're putting it together. So sometimes when you first turn a computer on, it'll take a couple cycles for it to actually start working, but it's working. See, it's all good. Now what I'm gonna do is check to make sure that everything is being properly recognized, that the CPU is running at the correct speed, that both memory modules are working, and that the hard drive is recognized. Because if any of that stuff is messed up, we're gonna have to figure out what the problem is. Oh, 3.7 gigahertz, I can hear the hard drive. Yeah, the hard drive's definitely running. All right, wow, that's a relief that it actually turned on. All right, so we got into the BIOS, so we know for the most part everything is working. So the next step is we're gonna deal with all of the cables and try to make it look a little bit nicer on the inside. So if you're new to PC building, when someone says cable management, all they're talking about is getting the cables organized in a way that doesn't impede airflow and looks pretty good. And I'm about to say something that's gonna make some PC builders angry, but it's true. In a build like this, cable management is really not that important. It's purely an aesthetic choice. In a high-end build that's overclocked and has power-hungry graphics cards, cable management does have an important influence on performance. High-end parts use a lot of power, and that produces a lot of heat. If your airflow isn't up to par, that heat can cause thermal throttling, which won't damage stuff, but it will limit your performance. In a build like this though, these are all pretty much entry-level parts. None of them are going to use a lot of power, and none of them produce a whole lot of heat. So the airflow aspect is really a non-issue here. However, this is a windowed case, and roughly the back half of the computer is going to be visible, so we do want to clean up the cables and make them look nice. And fortunately, this case has a ton of room in the front. We can hide cables up there, no problem. Because the exact details aren't really that important, I'll just do a quick time lapse of what's going on. Basically, I'll try to get all of the cables out of the way of the fans and away from the back of the case so they aren't visible through the window. Cue time lapse. So the cables are pretty much taken care of. As you can see, it looks a lot nicer now. Pretty much all I did was shove all the extra cables and extra length up at the front over the hard drive. There's no airflow up there anyway, and it's not visible from the window. So it's pretty well taken care of. Next, I'll show you how to install Windows, which is a super easy process these days. To install Windows 10, you'll need to make or buy a USB flash drive with the installer. Here, I'll show you how to make one, and all that's required is another computer and an empty flash drive 8 GB or larger. And don't worry, it's a really simple process. First, go to the link in the description, which leads to Microsoft's installation media page. Click Download Tool now, then run it once it's downloaded. It'll take a minute or two to prepare itself, then click Accept. Once the next screen loads, choose Create Installation Media, then click Next. On this page, you should be able to leave everything at the default, but if it allows you to pick, make sure you choose Windows 10 and 64-bit. And since we'll be putting it on a USB flash drive, make sure that's selected, then click Next. Now on this page, make sure you're selecting the right drive. I would recommend not having anything else plugged in, just the one that you're going to use, because this setup will format the drive and wipe all of the data on it. Make sure it's selected, then click Next. And at this point, it'll start downloading the installation media. It is a couple gigabytes, so depending on your internet speed, this could take 15 to 20 minutes. And that's all there is to it. Now we'll plug it into the other computer and install Windows. So once you've plugged in the USB drive and booted the computer, it should lead you to the Windows installation page. Now click Next, and then Install Now. This first screen is where you can put in your Windows key. I'm going to be transferring one from a different computer and I don't have it right now, so I'm going to click I don't have a product key. And on this screen, unless you entered a product key, you select which version you'll be using. And I'll be using Windows 10 Pro, so I'll click that and then click Next. Next, the license agreement. And on this screen, click Custom Windows Install Only. With the new hard drive, it should be all unallocated space, so just make sure it's selected and then click Next. And at this point, Windows will start copying files over to the hard drive and getting itself all installed. This process should only take 5 to 10 minutes. It's pretty quick these days. So once it's all installed, you'll get to the setup stuff. Select your region. I'm in the US, so I'll just click yes. And I'm in the US, so I'll be using a US keyboard. I don't want to add a second keyboard layout because I don't need to. Next, it'll ask to connect you to a network. If you have a wireless adapter or Ethernet cable, plug it in now. I'll be doing this later, so I'll just say skip for now. And then type in your name. I'm Ponchato, so I will click Next. Because no one else has access to my computers, and on this one I'm not going to have any important information anyway, I'm not going to include a password, but generally speaking, it's a good idea to have one. Now it'll ask if you want to make Cortana your personal assistant. Some people like it, I don't, so I'm going to say no. And now privacy settings, turn all of these off. That's pretty much just asking if they can take your information and sell it. You can say yes if you want, I guess. Now that we're here, the first and pretty much only thing we need to do is install the graphics drivers for the 1050 Ti. So I previously downloaded the drivers, but you can get them off of NVIDIA's website. And once it's downloaded, double click the executable, click yes, then click OK, and it'll extract a couple files. Once it's extracted, the NVIDIA installer will check to make sure that you have the right graphics card. GeForce Experience is NVIDIA's custom software that helps people decide what graphics settings are best and offer you a few other features. Personally, I don't use it, so I'm just going to go with the driver only. Then click agree and continue, and I'm going to do a custom install. And personally, I don't use any of this other stuff. The one that you might be interested in is the HD audio driver. That will allow your computer to run audio out of the HDMI port and through your monitor if that's how you have your sound system set up. Then click next. And now it'll install the drivers. Now all you need to do is install whatever software you'll be using with the computer and any of your gaming stuff like Steam or EA's Origin. Next, we'll see how this build performs in gaming. So first, we'll take a look at PUBG, a game notorious for its terrible performance. More people get in here already. I want it to be actual gameplay. You can't touch me. I'm Mike Tyson. I got an afro. Mike Tyson never had an afro, did he? All right, so on medium graphics settings, we're averaging just a little over 60 FPS with 1% lows around 30. That's not too bad, especially considering this is on medium. This game used to run a lot worse. Yeah, medium settings work pretty well. All right, so now we'll take a look at Rocket League. So I'm getting around 110, 120 FPS on average with 1% lows right around 95. Not bad performance, but playing on a keyboard is pretty bad. I'm gonna get a goal. I'm gonna get a goal here. Come on, come on, come on, come on, come on. I'm not gonna get a goal. No, 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 no. Oh. And now we'll take a look at Rainbow Six Siege. All right, so we're averaging around 90 frames per second with lows at about 85. That's actually really consistent. And that's especially impressive because we're running on the very high graphics preset. Not bad at all. Looks like Rainbow Six Siege runs pretty well. Now let's take a look at CSGO. I won. So I'm averaging about 130 to 160 FPS with 1% lows right around 90. And this is with the graphics settings all the way up, although I don't really know anyone who plays CSGO with the graphics all the way up, but if you do, this build will work. Now we'll take a look at GTA 5. This is with the graphics settings most of the way up except for anti-aliasing, averaging right around 60 FPS with 1% lows at 43 frames per second. And if you turn the graphics settings down, you'd be able to run it, of course, a lot faster than this, but I think GTA 5 is pretty enough that it's worth turning the graphics up. Pretty sure that would kill you. I guess a lot of things in this game would kill you. I'm sorry I can't hang out with... Oh. I guess that's that. Last but not least, we'll take a look at Fortnite. With the graphics settings on high, we're getting around 65 to 70 FPS on average, with 1% lows around 37. If you want to, you can bump it up to epic settings, but it does drop it a bit below 60 FPS. All in all, this is pretty great for a budget PC. More than enough power to run basically any game today at pretty good settings too. So that's it for the build. If you want to get these parts, click the link in the description. Hit subscribe and click the bell icon to get notified of new videos as soon as they're up. So guys, if you like this video, hit the like button. If you want to see more, hit subscribe. And if you have any questions on this PC or the build process, leave them in the comments below. Thanks for watching. I hope I helped, and I'll see you in the next video. Come on, get him. That's that. I am so glad that that worked. I am so glad that that turned on. I thought it wasn't going to.